Vice President Mike Pence says discussions are underway about winding down the White House coronavirus task force. Pence, who oversees the task force, told reporters Tuesday the management of the government's response to the pandemic could be turned over to federal agencies such as FEMA. He said that could happen by Memorial Day. The news appeared to catch at least one member of the task force off guard. In response to reports about this, Dr. Anthony Fauci told our Paula Reed, quote, "That's not true. I've been in every task force meeting, and that's not what they are doing." President Trump confirmed the task force would be winding down. Here's what he said during a roundtable with Native American tribal leaders Tuesday in Arizona.
Mike Pence and the task force have done a great job, but we're now looking at a little bit of a different form, and that form is safety and opening, and we'll have a different group probably set up for that.
Anita Kumar joins me now. She is a White House correspondent and associate editor for Politico. Anita, thanks very much for joining us. Let's start with the vice president's comments on the task force. What does that tell you about where the administration is trying to focus its attention?
Well, they've really been pushing this recovery, right? The reopening of America as opposed to the health piece of this. Now, obviously, these tests around the country continue, medical supplies continue, and there are, new cases and new deaths happening every day. But the White House has really been pushing to reopen the economy in each individual state. And that's really been their message, for the last several weeks.
Well, I also want to ask you about Dr. Fauci being caught off guard, it seems, by reports that the task force might be winding down. What does that suggest, Anita, about how the White House is making these types of decisions?
Well, we've seen over the last several months, really, that the White House has seemed to have a disconnect with the public health officials that work for the administration. There have been, time and time again, we've seen, the president say one thing, but see public health officials, including Dr. Fauci, say something else. When the president first talked about reopening way back when he was talking about Easter being the date, there was a disconnect there as well, with the public health officials saying this isn't the right time to do that. And you remember that the president pushed that off. But we've seen that time and time again. It's interesting because the vice president made those comments to reporters. He had reporters in to a briefing. And so they had been planning that for at least, today, quite some time, and didn't kind of loop everyone else in. But we do know that the task force has not been meeting every single day, and has kind of that Dr. Fauci and some of the doctors have already split off and are meeting separately from the rest of the White House.
Interesting. Anita, these task force briefings had really become these regular fixtures. And I think some folks are wondering, how will the American public hear from medical experts like Drs. Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx now, since these daily task force briefings are no longer happening?
It's a great question, but actually Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx have continued to do media interviews. So they have done, appeared on different shows, given interviews to different people, different news outlets. We just haven't seen them all in one place where we're all right there. But it's not just about the public health officials. The president, and at least some people close to the president, have felt that the briefings had not, the president himself thought the briefings were good, but he had a lot of advisors tell him that they didn't think this was working out well for him, that he was getting bad publicity, not good publicity. And it was better for him to sort of, take a back seat on that, not come out to these briefings. So what you're going to see now from the White House is a variety of things. You're going to see small briefings like the vice president did today. You're going to occasionally see the new press secretary out there doing those briefings that we used to have all the time. And you're going to see different interviews. The president's actually been doing his own interviews the last few days with Reuters and the New York Post. So they're looking at all different ways to get that message out to the media.
Well, Anita, the White House has blocked Dr. Fauci as well as HHS Secretary Alex Azar from testifying before the House. However, Dr. Fauci will be allowed to testify before the Senate. Why the distinction?
This is one of those times where it happens often. We heard something different from official White House from the official White House that we did from the president. Now, the White House says they're absolutely going to cooperate with Congress as they need to, but that Dr. Fauci is too busy right now dealing with the coronavirus to testify. Of course, he is going to testify in front of the Senate, which, as you know, is run by Republicans. But the president said today, actually, no, he doesn't think Dr. Fauci needs to go testify in front of the House because all the House members are Trump haters. They just want to show that he's doing a bad job in order for him to lose in November. So it's one of those situations where you hear two different things, but clearly the president has said to Dr. Fauci and to other administration officials, he does not want them to appear in the House at this time.
Anita, I also want to ask you about Dr. Rick Bright, the former director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, filed a whistleblower complaint Tuesday. Now, he says he was removed from his position because he opposed the broad use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. What more do we know about his complaint, and what happens next here?
Well, he's actually asking in this complaint for him to be reinstated to his job. If you'll remember, he's still at the administration, but he was moved to a different job. I think one of the most interesting things we saw today about this complaint was it wasn't just about this drug that the president had been touting, but actually he said he sounded the alarm with White House officials back in January, and that people in the administration were not getting ready for what was to come next with coronavirus. And that, obviously that's been one of the biggest complaints against the Trump administration. They did not prepare early on in January, and that's why they did not have enough medical supplies, enough tests ready to go. And what the doctor is saying is that they should have known that he was one of the people that told them in January that this should have been done, that they should have been preparing for it. So it's greater than just the drug, but that is definitely one of those big issues. So, the White House and the administration hasn't really responded yet to this today. What they've been saying is, they don't have a comment as this process goes forward. But we've heard them comment in the last couple of weeks as this has come up, and they say, there's no basis to this. They had criticized, there was some criticism of the job he was doing, all these things that we hadn't heard until just now, right? I mean, they're starting their defense of this change in his job.
Yeah, we'll watch that closely as it evolves. Meantime, President Trump traveled to Arizona Tuesday. It's his first time outside the Washington area in weeks. Anita, how important is it for him to start getting out of the White House and increase his visibility, especially in battleground states like Arizona?
I think it's really important for two reasons. One, I think it's really important for him personally. He is one of those people that needs to sort of get out of the house. He's been talking a lot about how he feels the need to get out of the White House. He wants to go out and talk to people and see people. But separately, of course, you're definitely right. This is really important time. We're only 6 months before Election Day. You can imagine if we weren't having coronavirus, he would be out very frequently, as would Joe Biden, holding campaign rallies and events talking about policies. He has said he's anxious to hold rallies again. Arizona would be a key place for him to do that. It's a swing state. He has several places he needs to go. He's mentioned that he's going to go to Ohio next week, but he just doesn't feel he can do these big rallies and events yet. He needs to continue to focus on the coronavirus, and he also can't have hundreds of people, thousands of people in one particular venue. So this is his way of getting out, seeing people, getting a message out there, but not having those campaign events yet. But I bet they will be coming soon if these guidelines permit. If states allow him to come, I am sure that he will be holding campaign events.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, though, to see what kind of social distancing rules, if any, they decide to enforce at these rallies. It's just sort of hard to imagine when you consider what these rallies looked like, sort of jam-packed people, jam-packed even waiting to get into these venues sometimes. And it'll be fascinating to see if those rallies come back, how and what form they'll actually take. Anita, a recent poll from the Washington Post found that a majority of Americans oppose the reopening of non-essential businesses such as dine-in restaurants, salons, gyms, and movie theaters. At the same time, of course, the president is continuing to push states to reopen. So how is the White House trying to balance the president's messaging with the concerns of Americans?
Well, I think he's going out there, as well as other officials, including the vice president, talking about how we'll slowly go back, right? We're not going to go back, just like you said, to those big rallies right away, that you can slowly go back. Restaurants can open, but they may not have seating for all the people that they normally would have. There might be some distance. So individual businesses and companies and venues will have to make that determination. But they have very much been pushing this. Let's get back to it. Let's get things open again, because they really very much want the economy to get moving again. So that is their balancing act. And I think that's one of the reasons that, as we just talked about, that they're sort of disbanding or talking about disbanding the task force, putting that with FEMA, and then pushing this message of let's get the economy going again.
I wonder, Anita, in your private conversations with aides, how much of a concern is there that the push to reopen could backfire? That is to say, there would be perhaps a resurgence of the virus in areas that do choose to reopen if people don't practice social distancing at those various businesses.
There's definitely a fear of that. There's talk about what would happen if, obviously there could be other people that are infected, but what if they have to pull back and say, let's go back to these stay-at-home orders in different states, or even issue federal guidelines? They see that as possibly a huge mistake for the president to make, something that could cost him the election. Obviously, there are public health costs as well that could cause more deaths, more infections across the country. So it is a gamble, it is a risk, and you have to assume that they've looked into both the health and economic factors at the same time.
Finally, Anita, in recent days, we've heard the president and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo escalate their rhetoric against China, slamming its initial handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, you recently wrote about this messaging. How is that going over with the president's supporters?
I talk to people all over the country, Republicans, Trump supporters, those that are in office, different legislators in statewide office, and they really are talking about China a lot. Now, obviously, there's some of that is Americans are looking for someone to blame for what has happened to this country, both economically and health-wise. But a lot of it is actually the president's talking points. We're seeing governors and legislators repeat the same words and messages that he is. So there's a lot of talk about how to blame China, which, the president hopes turns into that he is tougher on China than Joe Biden would be. And he wants this very much to be one of his political strategies for November. It's not going to be, the election's not going to be on what he thought it was going to be, which is the strong economy. And so he has switched gears, and he's talking about his response to coronavirus, but he's also talking about how tough he would be on China.
All right, Anita Kumar for us. Anita, thanks very much. Take care.